Hello and welcome to Sound Like, and in today's video we're going to be taking another look at Knights of Cydonia. In this video the interpretation we're going to be having is more of a blend between the studio version and the live versions of Knights of Cydonia, because that's just how I like the sounds for it, and it allows you to be a bit more creative with those sounds. As for the guitar I'm going to be using in this video, it is my Ibanez RG with a tremolo arm. As anyone who knows the song, you are going to need a tremolo arm to get the correct sound that we're going for. And also my Ibanez has some pickups in it that I really like the sound of. As for your amp settings, you're going to want to focus heavily on the mids on this one, with a fair balance between the bass and treble. And before we get started, don't forget to like, share and subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any of my content. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. So for the intro of Knights of Cydonia, we want to go for a strong guitar tone, and how I approach that is by going for a stacked drive approach. So I start with my Boss OS2 going into my Timmy overdrive. The settings I have for my Boss OS2 are to have the overdrive distortion control all the way over on overdrive and having the drive at 3 o'clock. And as for the Timmy overdrive, the gain is at 2 or 3 o'clock with a nice balance between the bass and the treble. And as for the stacked drive approach, this came through a lot of experimentation and finding that I do like the sound of the OS2 going into the Timmy overdrive. I find that the Timmy overdrive has a lot less power and drive behind it when compared to the OS2, so feeding the OS2 into the Timmy overdrive pulls out a lot of that drive, but it still retains quite a lot of the bulk behind it, and also creates that kind of boxy tone better than having the Timmy overdrive feed into the OS2. Stacking drives is not something I do quite often, but when I do it, I do like to go for this sort of approach of having this really overly saturated type of sound. It isn't something that you have to do yourself. If you've got an overdrive pedal that you think will do the job good enough, go for it. This is just something that I like to do. Creating lots of different sounds is something I do enjoy doing, for not just this song in particular, but for when I approach guitar tone in general. And this way I get a lot more sounds out of it than using pedals individually. So anyway, this is what it sounds like. Moving into part 2 of the intro now, we take the same signal chain as we used in part 1, but this time we're introducing some delay, and what I use is my Boss DD8. Whenever I use delay, I always use the analog setting on the DD8. I find that the trails have a much more rounded and more warmer sound to it than a digital delay, which recreates the sound exactly. And I like to have a much more rounded off kind of sound to have a much more nicer and richer type of ambience. I like to use delay for this particular part of the song because it adds something new and keeps the energy of the song moving. Admittedly, the studio version of the song sounds much more like it's a reverb than a delay, and live it kind of could be a bit open to interpretation. But to get a bigger, saturated type of ambience, I do like to lean towards more of a delay than a reverb. And with the idea of building a big ambience, I do like to have the level and the feedback turned up quite a lot so that we do get a big, overly saturated type of ambience. If you wanted to have something that's a little bit more in line with the studio version of the song, I'd suggest to go more of a reverb than a delay, with the settings being not so kind of out there as what I've got with the delay in here. And as we're talking about things that are open to interpretation, it's entirely up to you if you want to use the delay for the runoff or not. So let's check out both. For this section we're going to be using a lot of fuzz. The two fuzz pedals I'm using in this are my Fuzz Factory and my MXR Brown Acid. The effects chain that I'm running here starts off with my Fuzz Factory and then using my Boss ES8, splitting that signal with one side going straight into the amp rig and the other being put into my MXR Brown Acid and then onto my amp sound. To me, what this does is create a layered, saturated and interesting fuzz tone. We still get that sharp cut-through type sound from the Fuzz factory, but we also get that low-end gritty response from the brown acid. I know that in the previous section what we saw was that the drives were stacked, and what we're seeing here is more of a hybrid, where half of it is stacked and then the other half is one of those drives. Again, this came through quite a lot of experimentation by having the Fuzz factory being the basis of the sound, and then building on top of it is something that took quite a lot of experimentation, and that only really came through once I got my hands on my Boss ES8. If you're running a mono board and have nothing like the Boss ES8 where you can stack drives or have them in parallel or stereo or whatever, then I would suggest you still want to focus on a fuzz type tone. If what you have is not got the strength behind it compared to what I've got, I would say there's nothing wrong with you putting an overdrive pedal in front of that fuzz. But I would stress that having a fuzz pedal is what you should have at the end of your effects chain, as this section is overwhelmingly a fuzz sound. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you having an overdrive pedal in front of your fuzz to help build up that drive and that grit, but you need to have that fuzz pedal round off the entire sound. But with all that in mind, this is the sound that I've got. The verse is where the vocals come in and the guitar takes a step back from being the center of attention. And the pedals I'm using for this section are my whammy, Timmy overdrive and delay, but not in the order that you might expect. And what I'm doing here is using my Boss ES8 again to create a much more layered and thicker sound. So the signal chain for this section is my Timmy overdrive into my delay where the signal splits. One of those channels goes straight into the amp rig while the other has the whammy on it. The reason why I have my whammy in this position is so that I can set it to a shallow detune setting and still only affect half of the signal. What I'm also doing is using my volume pedal to send MIDI messages via the ES8 to control the treadle position on the whammy. Using the volume pedal as an expression pedal allows me to detune the guitar and only affect half of the signal, so we get one side which is not being affected by the whammy and the other side which is being affected by it, and blending those two together creates a much more layered and thicker and saturated sound. Having that sort of control over the tone allows me to evolve that sound as the section goes on. So when the full chords are going on, there's minimal detuning, so it's not really standing out. But when the short chords come in, I increase that detune so that it really stands out and really thickens up the overall sound that we're playing with. If you're running a mono board and therefore can't do the trick that I'm doing with my whammy pedal, I'd suggest you replace that with a modulation pedal. My suggestion here would be for a chorus pedal, as that's quite subtle, and when compared to the trick for the whammy pedal, it's quite similar. I would then also advocate for a much more conventional signal chain, so it's drive, modulation, and then delay. And the final thing that I'm using here is my FS5U foot switch as basically an on and off control for my whammy. So at the very end, I take it out, so it's just the normal undetuned tone for the big flurry before the intro riff starts over again. And this is what it all sounds like. For chorus 1, or the build-up, the sound that we're going for here is much more straightforward than ones that we've looked at previously. And what I'm doing here is splitting my signal, with one side going into my Boss OS2 and the other into the Timmy overdrive. So this time the drives aren't stacked, they're in isolation from each other, so we can hear what they're doing to the original guitar signal. And this is a technique that I use quite a lot when I want to have a rhythm sound that isn't too driven. Whilst the OS2 is quite strong and driven, having it essentially cut in half really brings down the level of the energy overall. And having the Timmy overdrive with its much more rounded off sound really fills in that other half that we're missing. Since we aren't stacking the drives, there's no buildup of noise, so what we're hearing is not as aggressive or as noisy as the intro sound. If you're running a monoboard and want to have a sound that's suitable for this section, I would suggest that you go with your intro sound but roll off quite a lot of gain on your guitar. One, so it cleans up quite nicely, but so that it is also quite different from that intro sound. As I say in a lot of these videos, I do like to have each section have its own sonic identity, and having this sound be quite similar to the intro sound, you do want to have it quite different as much as you can, so rolling off the gain on your guitar will help quite a lot. And this is what it sounds like. What I've got going on for chorus 2 is very similar to chorus 1, but only this time I'm adding my MXR brown acid after my Timmy overdrive. With this sound we're still preserving the boxy sound from the OS2, but this time we're introducing that low end gritty richness from the MXR brown acid, which is colouring the Timmy overdrive. Again, after some heavy experimentation, I find that this is a better end result than simply replacing the Timmy with the brown acid. What we get by having these two drives stacked together is having a much more stronger focus on the mid-range than having just the brown acid on its own. So in regard to this sound, it is running throughout the entire section, including the instrumental, the vocal part, and any improvisational stuff at the end. The only time it changes is when I may introduce my whammy pedal set to a harmony octave down at the beginning of the chain. Now this is a sound that doesn't appear in the studio version, and I don't believe has ever appeared in a live type sound. It is just an original sound that I like to add in myself. Adding a harmony octave down in this way is something that Matt does quite a lot, so it is Muse appropriate. And I only use this sound at the very end of the riff, which we'll see in the demonstration. It's entirely up to you if you want to go down that route. Like I said, it's not anything that we've heard in the live version or the studio version, it's just a Muse appropriate type sound. I don't always use it, I just have it if I want to change up the sound or if I want to play around with that if I want to. If you're running a mono board, you might find it difficult to dial in a sound that you find appropriate for this, as you want the openness from the OS2, that boxy overdrive sound, but that heavy, low, gritty punch from the fuzz pedal. So a compromise that I might suggest could be to take the intro sound going into a fuzz pedal, or the fuzz pedal going into the overdrive you use for the intro. It could be entirely up to you which order you want to stack those pedals, but obviously with the drawback of you having a mono board and playing in real time, whatever you've got the pedals set to previously is how you're going to run it. But my thought is, if you have a mono board, you are going to have to stack some pedals to get a sound that is going to be appropriate for this. You're going to want a sound that's going to be doing quite a lot, both the openness and that low gritty punch. I leave it up to you to decide which direction you go with this, but it could be a great opportunity to experiment with the tone that you have, or at the very least, give you some ideas about what pedals you want to get next. So with that in mind, what does my rig sound like? So there we go, that was Sound Like Knights of Cydonia. Compared to a lot of the Muse songs that I've covered in this series, this song offers a lot in terms of variety in how you want to go about creating sounds for it. A good example of this is at the end in the chorus where I'm introducing my whammy, which doesn't appear on any version that we've heard at all. It really gives you that opportunity to experiment and play around with it. And further still, this is one of those songs where I use the technique of stacking drives quite a lot, way more than I would with any other song. Usually I'm just using one drive at a time. But that was just my interpretation of how to sound like Knights of Cydonia. Let me know what you thought about it and what you'd pick in the comments below. I've been Harry, and thanks for watching.